What if Jesus and Buddha shared a divine teaching that could unite the world, but it was buried in silence? Could hidden scrolls and forbidden truths reveal a secret path lost to time? For centuries, these stories were locked away, dismissed as legend, erased by those who feared their power. In the final chapter, we uncover the one sacred truth both masters left behind, a revelation you will not want to miss. Chapter 1: Two Sons of Light, Parallel Paths Across Time. A soft wind carries whispers of a distant land where a child was born beneath a star that seemed to pierce the night sky with a promise. Centuries later, another cradle rocked under an auspicious glow as travelers spoke of portents and wonders. Two infants entered the world nearly a millennium apart, yet their births were marked by celestial signs and the hushed awe of those who watched. One first breathed under Roman rule in Galilee, the other took his first cry in the foothills of the Himalayas. Their mothers dreamed of radiant visions, their fathers sensed destinies far beyond mortal grasp. Yet despite the gulf of time and the chasm of geography, the echoes of their arrivals hinted at a singular design. Was it mere coincidence that two luminous lives would begin against such cosmic backdrops? Or was there a hidden thread weaving their origins together, stitching east to west and past to future? From the outset, their stories beckon us to peer beyond the surface of history, to question whether a single divine current runs through them both and flows unseen beneath the tapestry of tradition. Each young life would soon diverge from every expectation laid upon it. In Nazareth, a humble carpenter's son abandoned his family's tools and workshops as whispers of a higher calling stirred within him. Far to the northeast, a prince cast aside his palace's silken drapes and golden dishes in favor of tattered robes and a beggar's bowl. Both encounters with suffering marked the turning point of their journeys. One wandered dusty roads, drawn by the suffering of strangers and the murmur of their broken hearts. The other ventured into deep forests, where he knelt among roots and stones, contemplating the weight of human pain. Neither path was easy. Each man faced hunger's gnawing teeth and the disdain of those who judged their choices as folly. Yet in such hardship they found clarity, and in the crucible of deprivation they discovered a new realm of purpose. Where privilege once insulated them, they traded comfort for insight, charting courses that would lead to revelations neither birth nor bloodline could have foretold. Both seekers found themselves at odds with prevailing religious powers. Religious leaders flocked to witness Jesus as he spoke of a kingdom not built in Jerusalem but rising within the human heart. They bristled at his fearless challenge to temple authorities and their rigid laws. In a distant land, philosophers flocked to Siddhartha's side, unsettled by his dismissal of elaborate rituals and sacred dogmas. Monks who held fast to ancient chants watched as he urged them to look inward, to still the mind rather than recite words. These two prophets did not merely preach new ideas. They embodied a living question to every institution that claimed divine favor. Their presence alone unsettled those in control, for they hinted at a source of truth beyond written codes and established rites. Authorities sensed that if such teachings spread, the foundations of their power might crumble. And so both men found themselves pushed to the margins, embraced by the needy and reviled by the self-important. Their oppositional roles would echo through their teachings and shape the struggles that awaited them. Their spiritual awakenings stand among the most storied moments of human history. Jesus slipped away from the crowds that hailed him, finding solace in solitary prayer beneath gnarled olive trees as the sun dipped behind mountains. He emerged from each vigil with words of startling compassion, as if the hush of night had carried secrets meant only for his ears. Siddhartha sat beneath the Bodhi tree in long meditation, refusing food and drink until his body shook with the brink of collapse. On the dawn of his greatest trial, he gazed at the rising sun and reported a boundless serenity, an inner kingdom untouched by temptation. Each man returned to the world transformed and spoke of revelations so profound they would echo across continents. Yet their methods differed. One spoke through parable and proverb, weaving images of seed and shepherd, of vineyard and feast. The other pointed to breath and thought, to the quiet understanding that suffering springs from desire. Despite these stylistic contrasts, the underlying pulse of their insights beat the same rhythm, a call to look beyond the outer world and find the sacred within. Stories of miracles and awakenings swirl around both figures like mist around mountain peaks. Jesus healed the blind by touch, spoke to winds and waters as if they answered to his voice. Siddhartha liberated minds from fear, guiding seekers to transcendence through simple mindfulness of each breath. In both narratives, the impossible became commonplace for those in the presence of these men. Yet these tales were never ends in themselves but gateways to greater truths. The miracles served as signs pointing toward an inner awakening that any person could attain. They were not displays of power meant to enthrall unbelievers, but invitations to glimpse a deeper reality shimmering beneath everyday life. Still, to the powers that be, each act stirred panic. If blindness could vanish by a single touch, if sorrow could dissolve with a word or breath, why pay homage to elaborate temples or tithe to religious leaders? With each marvel, both prophets edged closer to a confrontation with the authorities determined to preserve the old order at any cost. Their messages pivoted on startlingly similar pillars. Jesus spoke of love so vast it embraced enemies, insisting that hatred blinded the soul more surely than a veil over the eyes. Buddha taught that attachment led inevitably to suffering, encouraging disciples to release clinging thoughts even for friends and family. Both men urged followers to abandon pride, to dissolve ego's walls, and to find refuge in the shared pulse of all living beings. They named divinity not as a distant ruler enthroned in unreachable glory, but as a spark within every human heart. Scripture and sutra alike would later struggle to define such truth in words that often missed its living essence. Yet in their earliest teachings, the heart of both prophets revealed itself plainly, a call to awaken, to transcend pain, and to dwell in boundless compassion. These resonances raise a crucial question. Did they tap into a single universal revelation? Or did one tradition unknowingly echo the insights of another long before scholars ever drew comparisons between them? Across time and terrain, the footprints of their journeys lead us to tantalizing clues. Desert scrolls uncovered in lost monasteries speak of a Western sage arriving to study under Eastern masters. Tibetan oral traditions whisper of a foreign monk whose words eerily matched those of their own enlightened ones. In Galilean caves, apocryphal writings hint at letters sent to distant lands. Some fragments describe teachings that sound more akin to Buddhist doctrine than to early Jewish thought. Meanwhile, Buddhist scribes cataloged travelers bearing news of a teacher who preached an inner kingdom rather than an external paradise. These tantalizing scraps survive only in hidden corners of libraries and private collections, shielded from prying eyes by layers of ecclesiastical and governmental secrecy. Historians debate their authenticity, archiving them as curiosities rather than core evidence. Yet their mere existence suggests a mingling of ideas far earlier than conventional history admits. If Jesus did journey east, or if Buddhist teachers visited Galilee, it would rewrite our understanding of spiritual heritage forever. Their final tests mirrored each other with uncanny fidelity. Jesus faced temptation in a wilderness where hunger gnawed and doubt whispered in his ear. He emerged resolute, carrying a new clarity back to the world of crowds and conflict. Siddhartha confronted Mara, the personification of fear and desire, in visions so intense they threatened to shatter his resolve. When daylight broke, he opened his eyes with the calm of one who had conquered all illusions. Each man then spoke with an authority born not of lineage or scholarship, but of direct experience. They taught not as intermediaries interpreting other voices, but as those who had communed with truth itself. In their words rang the conviction of one who had touched the heart of reality. And in the eyes of their listeners, one could see the spark of that recognition, that here stood those who had seen beyond suffering and returned to guide others along the hidden path. Yet for all their courage, both found themselves surrounded by suspicion and subterfuge. Word of Jesus spread quickly, drawing crowds whose faith outshone their understanding. Temple leaders felt their authority erode as parables of seeds and soil sowed new seeds of doubt. Buddha's disciples multiplied as he traversed kingdoms, yet Brahmin priests seethed at his refusal to honor caste and ritual. Each authority saw in these guides a threat to the social order they upheld. Unable to reconcile such radical teachings with established structure, they moved to silence the voice they could not control. Exile, ostracism, even threats of violence shadowed both teachers in their final years. The very charisma that inspired devotion also bred resentment among those who wielded power. It is a pattern as old as history itself. When light shines too brightly on hidden truths, those who thrive in darkness will attempt to extinguish it. Today we stand at the threshold of that concealed heritage. Conventional histories frame Jesus and Buddha as isolated prophets of separate faiths. Textbooks neatly compartmentalize their lives into distant chapters, rival narratives with no dialogue between them. Yet beneath that tidy veneer lies a labyrinth of forgotten texts, suppressed teachings, and hidden archives. What if the true story spans continents like the Silk Road, weaving Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Aramaic into a single tapestry? What if the echoes of their messages are not mere coincidence but signs of a shared wisdom that predates both Christianity and Buddhism? Tracing those echoes will take us beyond canonical gospels and revered sutras into places few scholars dare to tread. In the chapters that follow, we will sift through the dust of centuries, follow the trails of vanished scrolls, and listen for the silent harmonies that bind two great traditions together. By understanding how these two sons of light walked parallel paths, we open a door to questioning all we thought we knew. The patterns of their births, journeys, trials, and triumphs hint at a unity hidden beneath the surface of religious history. Was this similarity merely symbolic, a story crafted by later admirers to glorify distant pasts? Or does it point to a universal revelation that transcends culture, creed, and chronology? As we press deeper, we risk unsettling our most cherished beliefs and facing resistance from guardians of faith who have long guarded the status quo. Yet the promise is profound, a glimpse of the one teaching they both discovered, one that could redefine the nature of spirituality itself. Turn the page, follow the path, and prepare to see Jesus and Buddha not as isolated icons, but as twin lamps illuminating the same timeless truth. In Chapter 2, we venture into the silent years of Jesus' life and the hidden manuscripts of the East, tracing whispers of journeys that may connect him to Buddhist masters. We will weigh the evidence of ancient scrolls and oral traditions, facing the question of whether this remarkable sage truly crossed the Himalayas in search of deeper insight. Hold tight to your curiosity, for the journey grows more astonishing with every step. Before we continue to Chapter 2, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's proceed with tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Years. Where was Jesus and who taught him? Between the boy in the temple and the man who emerged from the desert, there is silence. The Gospels offer almost nothing about Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30. It is as if he vanished into the hills of Galilee and returned decades later, transformed. This void has haunted theologians and seekers alike. Why would the most influential figure in Western spirituality have nearly 2 decades erased from the record? Some claim he lived a quiet life as a carpenter, hidden away in Nazareth, but others, peering deeper into ancient scrolls and oral traditions, whisper of something far more astonishing. They speak of a journey eastward, through Persia, along the Silk Road, toward the Himalayas. In monasteries tucked away in snowy valleys, in caves where monks recited mantras beside flickering butter lamps, stories linger of a foreign sage who asked strange questions and spoke of a God within. The silence of Scripture, they say, may be filled with footprints left in snow and sand. In the northern Indian region of Ladakh, beneath the long shadows of ancient stupas and prayer flags whipping in mountain winds, a series of manuscripts were uncovered in the late 19th century. Stored in a Buddhist monastery in Hemis, these scrolls were fragile with age, ink fading across parchment darkened by centuries of incense. According to some reports, they spoke of a man named Isa, a holy one from the West who studied the sacred Dharma and lived among monks for many years. Isa is a name strangely close to how Jesus was known in Arabic and Persian lands. The stories claimed he arrived humbly, wearing traveler's robes, with eyes full of sadness and questions. He debated with scholars, fasted in isolation, and learned the practices of meditation and compassion. Though dismissed by many historians as legend, the monks of Hemis have kept these tales alive. For them, the man called Isa was no myth. He was real, and he had once walked their very paths. The accounts of this mysterious traveler were first brought to global attention by a Russian explorer named Nicholas Notovich. After injuring his leg in the Himalayas, he was taken to the Hemis monastery to recover. There, the monks supposedly shared the story of Isa with him, revealing pages of the sacred scrolls. Notovich later published a book about his discovery, igniting a storm of debate. Skeptics accused him of fabrication. Scholars denounced the tale as too convenient, too perfect. Yet years later, other explorers claimed to find the same legends still told by the monks. Some were even granted limited access to similar scrolls, though the content remained vague and carefully guarded. Whether authentic or embellished, the fact that multiple sources from the region speak of a teacher from the West who studied Buddhist wisdom is difficult to ignore. Could the Vatican's silence about Jesus' missing years conceal more than mystery? Could it be protecting a journey that would forever alter the way the world views the origins of Christianity? Further west, in the high valleys of Kashmir, oral traditions persist among certain communities that tell of a holy man from the land of Israel who came to learn and never left. These legends speak of a wise figure who did not die on a cross but instead found refuge among sages, teaching and meditating until his final days. While this narrative diverges wildly from Orthodox Christian teachings, its presence in both Hindu and Muslim storytelling cannot be dismissed as mere folklore. Some even believe a tomb exists in the city of Srinagar, marked not with grandeur but with mystery, known as the Rosable Shrine. Local belief holds that it contains the remains of a man who came from the West and whose teachings blurred the lines between East and West, between body and soul. Whether these accounts preserve truth or myth, their endurance across generations suggests that something profound occurred in the shadows of the Himalayas, something not recorded in any Western gospel. Intriguing connections also arise when we compare the practices and teachings of Jesus with those of Buddhist monks. The way Jesus withdrew into the wilderness for extended periods of meditation closely mirrors the ascetic traditions of Eastern mystics. His teachings about loving enemies, turning the other cheek, and finding the kingdom within all reflect an understanding of inner transformation more akin to Buddhist renunciation than to the fiery justice expected of the Messiah. His disregard for temple rituals, his parables about stillness, and his insistence that the divine resides not in buildings but in the heart, these all align with the Buddhist view of transcendence beyond form. Some scholars have noted that the idea of rebirth in a spiritual sense, emphasized by Jesus, parallels the Buddhist understanding of liberation from suffering. Were these similarities born from shared human experience alone? Or did Jesus learn these ideas firsthand, absorbing them during a time deliberately hidden from view? To grasp how Jesus could have undertaken such a journey, we must understand the world he lived in. The first century was not as isolated as many imagine. Trade routes connected Rome to India. Caravans carried goods, scrolls, and stories across thousands of miles. Buddhist missionaries were already moving westward. Persian and Indian sages traveled through the same regions where Jewish communities lived. The Silk Road was more than a commercial route, it was a corridor of ideas. It is entirely plausible that a young seeker, hungry for truth and disillusioned with local authorities, could find passage eastward with traveling merchants. Along the way, he would have encountered Zoroastrian mystics in Persia, Brahmin scholars in the Indus Valley, and finally, Buddhist monks in the foothills of Tibet. For a young man drawn to silence, compassion, and wisdom, this journey would not only have been possible, it would have been inevitable. Evidence of cultural and spiritual exchange between East and West continues to emerge from unlikely corners. Ancient Buddhist statues have been unearthed in Afghanistan with Greek artistic features, suggesting a long-standing syncretism between Hellenistic and Indian cultures. Coins bearing Roman emperors have been found in southern India, indicating active trade routes. Philosophical texts from Alexandria show surprising familiarity with Indian ideas. Against this backdrop, a Jewish mystic traveling to the East and absorbing foreign teachings becomes not only possible but historically consistent. If Jesus lived in these melting pots of wisdom and belief, his return to Galilee would have carried more than memory. He would have brought back practices and insights foreign to his people. He would have spoken of meditation, of compassion as a path, of liberation through surrender. His voice would have sounded familiar to some, but deeply threatening to those who guarded the old ways. And perhaps that is why his teachings needed to be buried, reshaped, or erased. Some esoteric Christian sects, now labeled heretical, seem to preserve echoes of this missing journey. The Gnostics, for instance, spoke of inner light, divine knowledge, and the path of awakening through self-realization. Their texts, unearthed in Nag Hammadi in the 20th century, describe a Jesus who taught not obedience to law but liberation from illusion. His words urge listeners to go inward, to transcend duality, to know the divine within. These teachings, so unlike the hierarchical doctrines of later Christianity, bear uncanny resemblance to Buddhist principles. Is it coincidence that these writings were hidden for centuries, buried in jars beneath the desert to avoid destruction? Or were they remnants of a different Christianity, one rooted in a master who had walked beyond Judea, who had tasted truths whispered beneath Bodhi trees and echoed in mountain caves? If so, then the suppression of this version of Jesus was not merely theological. It was political. It was strategic. The Vatican has long maintained strict control over what counts as authentic Christian doctrine. Councils over the centuries rejected texts deemed inconsistent with the chosen narrative. Stories that spoke of travel, of teachings that challenged temple authority or hinted at foreign influence, were labeled apocryphal and banned. Many were destroyed. Others were quietly sealed in archives where few eyes could ever see them. The silence around Jesus' missing years is not accidental. It is protected. The Church has no incentive to explore a history that might align Jesus with Buddhism or Eastern mysticism. Such revelations could unravel centuries of authority and dogma. They could decentralize faith, returning it to the individual rather than the institution. They could expose the fragile walls between East and West as human constructs, not divine divides. And so the mystery persists, with just enough trace evidence to provoke but not to prove. Unless, of course, one dares to keep digging. Today, scattered throughout temples, monasteries, and ancient libraries, clues remain. Fragmented scrolls in Sanskrit, Pali, and Persian. Dusty Christian manuscripts once branded heretical. Stone carvings with unfamiliar symbols. Accounts from early travelers who were dismissed or discredited. No single artifact solves the riddle, but together they form a pattern, like constellations in a forgotten sky. When one follows them, they point eastward, not just toward the land of the Buddha, but toward a possibility. That Jesus was not only a Jewish rabbi, but also a seeker who found wisdom far from home. A man who returned transformed, carrying a message so universal that it threatened every gatekeeper of spiritual control. The story is too grand to rest in one tradition alone, and that may be the very reason it was fractured, scattered, and buried. If Jesus truly walked among monks, sat cross-legged before ancient masters, and learned from those who spoke of suffering and release, then Christianity must be re-examined from its roots. It becomes not a solitary revelation, but a meeting point, not a closed system, but an open path. The forgotten years, if uncovered, would shake the foundations of doctrine and hierarchy. But they would also open a door to something greater than religion, something timeless and whole. A vision of faith without borders. A map etched not in blood or conquest, but in footprints across desert and mountain, scroll and cave, silence and awakening. The story was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be lived. In Chapter 3, we will shift our focus from the journey to the message itself. We will compare the core teachings of Jesus and the Buddha, teachings so close in spirit they almost whisper with one voice. Love, detachment, the kingdom within. Were they speaking different languages to reveal the same divine truth? Or were they echoing a revelation older than both their lifetimes? The answer lies in the words they left behind and the silence that followed them. Chapter 3, teachings too similar to ignore: love, detachment, and inner kingdoms. In quiet villages and bustling towns, the words of two masters found eager ears. Both spoke of love so radical it shattered old notions of friend and foe. Their messages circulated first by mouth, then by hurried scribes, carrying tales of a command to love enemies as one loved oneself. To those who heard it, the idea was unsettling. It demanded that hatred be met not with equal force but with compassion. In Galilee, crowds paused at the notion that kindness could disarm cruelty. In India, villagers nodded at the belief that generosity bound all life in a single web. Neither tradition claimed ownership of the insight. Yet centuries later, scholars would note the uncanny echo, a teaching that seemed too precise to arise independently. How could two separate cultures, divided by ocean and time, arrive at the same moral heart? If these instructions were more than shared wisdom, they pointed toward a universal revelation buried beneath temple walls and coded in the silence of missing years. Beyond the command to love, each sage urged detachment from worldly desire as the surest path to freedom. Jesus spoke of treasures stored not on earth but in heaven, warning that hearts anchored to wealth would drift from true purpose. Buddha instructed monks to let go of clinging, to watch desires like passing clouds and ground themselves in simple awareness. Both counseled a radical reorientation away from possessions, prestige, and power. Listeners raised eyebrows at teachings that seemed to deny ambition itself, as if salvation lay not in conquest but in surrender. Yet these words resonated deeply in every social stratum. The poor found hope in the promise that the simple life held its own dignity. The wealthy shuddered at the thought that their fortunes might be burdens. And the rulers trembled at the implication that true authority resided not in crowns or thrones but in hearts unbound by greed. The parallels here are impossible to ignore. They bear the signature of a single divine lesson spoken in two dialects. Central to both traditions is the revelation of an inner kingdom or inner awakening. Jesus described a realm within each person, a kingdom invisible to the eye yet more real than stone and temple. Buddha revealed the luminous mind, a radiant clarity beyond thoughts, emotions, and senses. Each taught that liberation was not found through external rituals alone, but through cultivating a direct experience of the sacred within. Congregations and sanghas experimented with prayer and meditation in search of glimpses of this hidden realm. Yet official institutions often resisted these inward turns, fearing that if believers discovered divinity within, their control would slip away. Papal documents from the Middle Ages caution against excessive soul-searching, admonishing readers to obey clergy rather than trust individual revelation. Councils condemned meditation as suspect if it led to visions not sanctioned by doctrine. Meanwhile, monastic codes in Asia warned novices not to stray into ecstatic states without an elder's guidance. Both sets of authorities, though worlds apart, sought to contain the ineffable. When we compare texts, the similarities deepen. Jesus spoke of a light shining in the darkness and urged followers to kindle their own lamps. Buddha taught that every being contained the potential for unshakable awakening, calling it Buddha nature. The echo is more than metaphor. Both words point to a living flame at the center of consciousness. Jesus likened faith to a mustard seed that could move mountains. Buddha compared insight to a tiny spark that grew into a boundless fire of wisdom. Each story illustrates how small realizations can expand into world-changing clarity. In remote monasteries, Buddhist teachers recite verses about seed and sapling that parallel parables from Galilean storytellers. In dusty libraries, theologians puzzle over passages that sound more Eastern than Jewish. Some Vatican scholars attempted to reinterpret these overlaps as mere coincidence or symbolic borrowing, yet private notes reveal anxiety over too close resemblances. The risk was obvious. If Christian faith admitted roots in an older, widespread tradition, its claim to unique revelation risked collapse. Neither master taught asceticism for its own sake. Their detachment was a means to an end, compassion fueled by deep insight. Jesus forgave those who crucified him, insisting that mercy outstrip justice in revealing divine character. Buddha taught that hatred begets hatred and that only boundless compassion could break the cycle of suffering. Both insisted that liberation from suffering required a transformation of the heart, a turning away from revenge and toward care. Pilgrims in both traditions walked vast distances to witness demonstrations of forgiveness and loving kindness, hoping to taste a fraction of that power. They returned to their homes with stories of mercy that softened hardened families and communities. Yet when institutional leaders sensed that the energy of compassion might flood beyond their walls, they steered followers back toward accepted practices. They emphasized confession, penance, or ritual offerings instead of direct acts of selfless love. The subtle pressure redirected devotion from lived compassion to controlled ceremony, muting the radical call to love without boundary that lay at the core of both messages. The call to nonviolence further unites these teachings. Jesus refused to wield resistance against oppressive powers, insisting that swords would only perish by swords. He stood before armed guards and did not draw a weapon. Buddha likewise preached non-harm, urging followers to practice ahimsa in thought, word, and deed. For soldiers and rebels alike, these doctrines rang with both hope and menace. They promised an end to cycles of violence, yet undermined the very concept of justified war. Rulers and generals branded these views as impractical or even seditious. Church leaders debated whether force could ever be sanctified, crafting doctrines of holy war that sidestepped the master's original intent. Buddhist kingdoms in Asia wavered between armies of monks and spiritual diplomats, reluctant to embrace total pacifism. Across centuries, official interpretations softened the edges of nonviolence, allowing exceptions for self-defense or political necessity. In doing so, institutions distanced themselves from the radical purity of both prophets. The unity of their vision extends into how they valued everyday life. Jesus blessed children and bread, elevating the simplest moments to sacrament. Buddha found sacredness in each breath, teaching that mindfulness in mundane tasks revealed the whole of existence. Both rejected the notion that spirituality belonged only to priests or monks. They welcomed fishermen, tax collectors, and farmers into their circles without demanding elaborate initiation rites. Ordinary lives became vessels for extraordinary awakening. Followers from distant lands embraced this message, setting aside caste rules and social hierarchies. Yet once institutions formed around these movements, they often reestablished privilege. Churches erected grand cathedrals and claimed the sacraments as their exclusive domain. Monasteries closed their doors to laity, insisting on strict ordination before sharing advanced teachings. In both traditions, the open-door ethos of the founders gave way to guarded corridors. The friction between inclusion and exclusion reflects a struggle to contain a teaching that promised freedom to all, not just to those in holy orders. Perhaps the most startling overlap lies in how both masters addressed the fear of death. Jesus spoke of eternal life as a present reality, not merely a future promise. Buddha taught the dissolution of self into a timeless flow, a release from the wheel of birth and death. In both narratives, death is reframed from an ultimate end to a threshold into a larger mystery. Their words comforted mourners, inviting them to view mortality through the lens of transformation rather than loss. Pilgrims reported visions of a realm beyond sorrow, where souls traveled as light across infinite horizons. Yet dogmatic authorities often curtailed such teachings, framing the afterlife in rigid terms of paradise and hell. They codified barriers that distinguished saved from damned and bound innocents to sacrament and creed. Both prophets, by contrast, hinted at a boundless mystery beyond human judgment. A teaching so expansive threatened the gates of doctrine, prompting theologians to tighten their hold on eschatological narratives. In private Vatican records, theologians fretted over parallels between gospel passages and Buddhist sutras. Marginal notes question whether certain phrases were too closely aligned with Eastern texts. Papal correspondences reveal concern that scholars would trace similarities back to a common source, undermining exclusivity. Decrees were issued banning unauthorized translations of Buddhist writings in Latin Europe. Monastic libraries carefully cataloged Eastern manuscripts, restricting access to only the highest-ranking clerics. These measures speak volumes. The Church recognized that these overlaps were not trivial but potentially explosive. They knew that if Christians accepted the idea that Jesus' teachings emerged from a broader spiritual current, their claim to divine singularity would erode. Similarly, in Asian courts, kings kept strict watch over foreign preachers using language too reminiscent of Christian scripture. Both powers suppressed the intermingling of ideas to preserve the boundaries of faith. Modern scholarship often treats these parallels as curious coincidences or later syncretism. Academic papers chart the diffusion of ideas along trade routes, attributing overlaps to cultural osmosis rather than shared revelation. Critics dismiss any suggestion of divine unity as fanciful, insisting on clear lines between East and West. Yet these compartmentalized narratives depend on selective readings of history. They ignore marginal archives, dismiss oral traditions, and overlook the unspoken anxieties hidden in institutional records. The true pattern emerges when one abandons rigid categories and listens to the resonant chord struck by both masters. The chord sounds in the imperative to love beyond boundaries, to detach from worldly cravings, and to discover a living kingdom within. It reverberates in the courage to confront suffering with nonviolence, to celebrate the sacred in every breath, and to face death as a passage rather than a prison. If we allow these teachings to speak for themselves, they offer a transformative map for modern life. They challenge contemporary obsessions with consumption, competition, and control, They invite individuals to lean into love when anger feels easier, to let go when fear demands holding tight, and to turn inward when distraction beckons outward. They call for a radical embrace of compassion as both practice and destiny. Yet the most profound implication is that these insights transcend culture, language, and creed. They are not regional philosophies but universal truths encoded in two lives lived far apart yet in startling harmony. To accept this unity is to glimpse a perennial wisdom that predates human institutions. It is to stand at the confluence of East and West and feel the current of awakening flowing freely. As the echoes of love and detachment fade into silence, we see how institutions worked to muffle this shared message. In the next chapter, we will journey through the councils and inquisitions that branded mystic voices as heresy, burned books that threatened the status quo, and remapped spiritual history to erase the harmonies between two great traditions. Only by understanding how power silenced the echo can we reclaim the original resonance of their divine teaching. Chapter 4: Heretics, Mystics, and Burned Books. How the Church Silenced the Echo. In the centuries after the great teachers walked the earth, small circles of disciples carried forward their most radical insights. These were souls drawn to direct experience rather than rote ritual. They practiced contemplative silence, sought inner illumination, and spoke of a spark of divinity glowing in every heart. They called themselves Gnostics, meaning those who knew. Their gatherings were simple, often held in hidden chambers beneath streets or in secluded desert caves. They shared stories of cosmic journeys, of light shining through layers of illusion. Their teachings echoed both the parables of Jesus and the sutras of the Buddha. Yet for every small community that embraced this vision, a tide of opposition rose. Established authorities saw in these mystics a threat to hierarchy. If each person could know the divine directly, then the role of priest, teacher, or pontiff became redundant. And so the machinery of heresy hunting began to turn. Councils of bishops convened to define orthodoxy and condemn all else. In heated debates that lasted weeks, they labeled Gnostic texts as dangerous fantasies. They argued that secret knowledge belonged only to the initiated few and that broad access would lead to chaos. These councils issued formal edicts ordering the destruction of any writings that strayed from the approved narrative. In city after city, scribes collected suspect scrolls and snuffed out their flames in public squares. The thunder of church pronouncements echoed through the streets as bishops anathematized those who refused to recant. Many mystics fled into the wilderness or into hiding beneath the sands of the Egyptian deserts. The bravest continued to copy their sacred texts by memory, whispering verses under moonlight in hopes that some trace might survive. Yet the momentum of state-backed orthodoxy proved merciless, and entire libraries vanished under piles of ash. Among the early mystics were the Desert Fathers, men and women who forsook urban life to seek solitude in barren lands. They sat beneath scorched sun and freezing stars, meditating for days on end. Some practiced breath awareness, others observed strict silence, and a few fasted until their bodies trembled on the brink of collapse. Their accounts describe visions of radiant beings and inner realms of light. These revelations bore striking resemblance to descriptions in Buddhist texts from faraway Asia. Yet when word of their insights reached Christian centers, church leaders branded them as lunatics or heretics. Monasteries under official auspices were forbidden from teaching such practices. Any monk found reciting these unapproved visions risked expulsion or worse. The desert fathers' freedom dissolved under the weight of ecclesiastical decree, and their texts were added to the ever-growing list of banned works. Only fragments survived, hidden in the corners of later monasteries. As the Christian empire solidified under imperial patronage, the stakes grew higher. Constantine's conversion had fused church and state, making religious dissent a civil offense. Bishops gained power to order execution, and heresy became synonymous with treason. Inquisitions rose to prominence, empowered to root out spiritual deviation with cold efficiency. Swords and fire replaced debate. Inquisition tribunals questioned suspected mystics in secret chambers lit by flickering torches. Confessions were extracted under threat of torment. Those who admitted to practicing forbidden contemplations were marched to pyres, their scriptures cast into roaring flames. One by one, the delicate scrolls that recorded visions of unity, non-duality, and inner awakening were consigned to ash. The public spectacle served as warning and spectacle. Faith was tethered ever more tightly to official dogma, and the deeper echoes of Jesus and Buddha were driven further underground. Behind closed doors, theologians drafted revised catechisms and prayer books that excised any language hinting at Eastern resonance. Terms like enlightenment or inner light were replaced with sanctioned words that aligned strictly with church doctrine. Scriptoria copied new editions of the Gospels, smoothing over passages that mirrored Buddhist principles of detachment and compassion. Scribes rephrased teachings of inner surrender to emphasize obedience to clergy rather than personal awakening. These editorial shifts seemed minor, but over generations they shaped the beliefs of millions. The radical core of mystic teachings was diluted into comfortable patterns of ritual and sacrifice. Monastic orders supervised every aspect of spiritual life, from confession schedules to prescribed prayers. Any impulse toward inner exploration outside these mandates was met with suspicion. Those few who still remembered alternative ways often lived and died before they could pass them on, taking secret methods with them into unmarked graves. In the eastern reaches of the empire, similar suppressions took root. Byzantine councils declared all foreign influences suspect. Monasteries were instructed to burn any texts written in unfamiliar scripts or containing strange imagery. Pilgrims returning from the east were interrogated, their belongings searched for unauthorized manuscripts. Ruins of once thriving libraries testify to the zeal of these purges. Tales survive of travelers who escaped with fragments of scrolls tucked inside wooden staffs. They passed these shards from hand to hand, uttering warnings to cherish hidden knowledge. Despite the ever-tightening net, whispers of alternative teachings persisted in shadow schools. These groups met at night in abandoned basilicas, drawing symbols in dust and chanting sutras alongside psalms. But the risk was constant. Informers delivered names for rewards, and secret chambers were discovered. One by one, the conduits to a wider spiritual heritage were severed. Inquisitions extended their reach into medieval Europe, targeting not only heretics but also Jews, pagans, and anyone deemed spiritually errant. Entire communities were uprooted and dispersed. Booksellers were required to register texts with church authorities. Those found carrying unapproved scrolls were branded as collaborators with the devil. The great libraries of Spain and France were purged of suspect volumes. Even scholars who dared to discuss similarities between Christian and Buddhist ethics risked censure. Universities enforced strict codes of orthodoxy, expelling professors who mentioned detachment, inner light, or universal compassion in ways that echoed Eastern thought. The atmosphere of fear silenced open inquiry and drove independent seekers into remote corners. In every city and kingdom, the machinery of suppression erased the diversity of spiritual voices that once mingled freely at the crossroads of civilization. The burning of books was not merely an act of destruction but a symbol of dominance. Flames leapt into the sky as neighbors watched in awe and terror. Ashes scattered in the wind carried more than the remnants of fragile pages. They carried the possibility of liberation from rigid structures. Each incineration proclaimed the message that the Church alone held the keys to truth, that authority went unchallenged for centuries. Meanwhile, Buddhist monasteries in Central Asia experienced their own cycles of persecution and revival, but none matched the scale of the Christian Inquisitions. The irony remains that both traditions betrayed their founders by outlawing the very practices those founders embodied: direct, unmediated contact with the divine. In the process, spiritual heritage spanning continents and centuries was shredded, leaving only sanitized fragments for future generations to rediscover. Hidden beneath layers of ecclesiastical bureaucracy lie vaults filled with testimony against the mystics. Indictments, confessions, and execution orders fill dusty ledgers. They record the names of men and women who dared to teach that salvation was a matter of the heart rather than a function of the Church. Some entries note how these teachers quoted passages that uncannily resembled Buddhist discourses, stirring dread among church officials. Yet these records were rarely accessible to the public. Locked in secret archives, they serve as cold proof of the systematic campaign to silence echoes of universal awakening. Only a handful of historians have gained entry, and they speak of manuscripts chained behind iron gates. They whisper of volumes stamped with the papal seal and inscribed with warnings against unauthorized readers. These forbidden tomes hold traces of a story that institutions labored to conceal. Despite the formidable efforts to erase these teachings, some fragments survived through syncretic traditions. Folk healers, wandering dervishes, and itinerant preachers preserved bits of mystic lore alongside local customs. In North Africa, one hears tales of saints who meditated beneath olive trees, reciting verses that sound more like mantras than psalms. In southern France, troubadours sang songs of inner light that recall descriptions from ancient sutras. These oral traditions, passed across generations, adapted teachings to regional contexts, disguising them within legend and song. Church authorities tolerated some of these practices as harmless folklore, unaware that beneath the surface lay echoes of profound truths. In this way, the buried wisdom continued to seep through cracks in the institutional dam, awaiting rediscovery by those with ears to hear and hearts to remember. The systematic silencing of mystic voices has left modern seekers with a fractured spiritual lineage. Many assume that contemplative practices emerged only centuries after the prophets. They accept the notion that inner transformation is a later innovation rather than a core teaching. Yet the traces uncovered in secret edicts, burned catalogs, and hidden archives tell a different story. They reveal fierce struggles over who could access the divine spark. They show how power reshapes faith to secure compliance and control. And they remind us that the radical teachings of Jesus and the Buddha once stood in alignment, inspiring communities to live by compassion, detachment, and inner revolution. Those communities were dismantled, their texts obliterated, and their teachers branded as outlaws. The loss is immense, but so too is the promise of recovery. As we prepare to explore the scattered scriptures that escaped the flames, we see how councils and inquisitions forged a narrow path for faith to follow. They severed branches from a vast tree of awakening, leaving only official doctrine to bear fruit. In Chapter 5, we will venture into the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of Asia to unearth the Gospels they don't read aloud. We will piece together fragments from the Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas in India, and Buddhist sutras along the Silk Road. Through these lost texts, the hidden echoes of two masterful lives will resound once more. Chapter 5. Lost Texts from the East and West, the Gospels they don't read aloud. In the shifting sands of Egypt's western desert, early Christian hermits hid fragile scrolls in clay jars and secret cavern walls. Across the mountains of Central Asia, Buddhist monks stored sutras in hidden alcoves behind prayer wheels. These lost texts survived centuries of neglect, awaiting discovery by explorers and scholars. Among the most tantalizing finds is the Gospel of Thomas, unearthed at Nag Hammadi. Unlike the familiar four Gospels, this collection of sayings reads like a handbook for inner discovery. In Indian caves, the Acts of Thomas recount an apostle's mission among Syriac-speaking communities, blending local legend with sacred instruction. And along the Silk Road, fragments of Mahayana sutras reveal insights strikingly akin to apocryphal Christian teachings. Piecing together these disparate writings, a parallel scripture emerges, one that transcends the boundaries of faith and geography. It speaks not of dogma or institution but of personal awakening, urging seekers to listen for the still, small voice within. These texts shine a light on a shared heritage the world was never meant to forget. The Gospel of Thomas stands apart because it lacks narrative structure. It offers terse declarations attributed to the teacher, each a seed meant to germinate within the listener's heart. In one passage, the divine realm is likened to a hidden treasure, waiting to be found by those who dig deep within themselves. In another, the disciple is urged to become a knower rather than a ritualist. Such language resonates with Buddhist discourses that equate enlightenment to unearthing the true nature of mind. Monks in Dunhuang recorded similar metaphors in their sutras, describing the mind as a field where seeds of ignorance and wisdom vie for dominance. The Gospel of Thomas confronts the reader with questions rather than certainties, provoking an inner quest. Its ambiguity unsettled early church leaders who feared private interpretation. Branded heretical, it was buried alongside other Gnostic texts. Yet its survival testifies to an undercurrent of belief that truth belongs to the individual soul, not to hierarchies. Further east, the Acts of Thomas recounts the apostles' journey into the lands now known as Kerala. Local tradition holds that Thomas founded communities of believers who blended Jewish-Christian rituals with indigenous ascetic practices. Stories describe his debates with Brahmin scholars and his use of simple parables to illustrate profound points. Legends speak of him fasting in remote forests, subsisting on alms and meditation, much like Buddhist monks wandering for alms. Fragments of this text survived in Syriac, Malayalam, and Pahlavi translations, preserved by underground Christian groups. Though dismissed by later councils, it offers a glimpse of an early Christianity open to local wisdom. In its verses, Thomas urges seekers to detach from honor and wealth, echoing the Buddhist precept of non-clinging. He speaks of a kingdom within, mirroring Eastern descriptions of luminous mind. The Acts of Thomas highlights how Christian and Buddhist traditions could intertwine when free from institutional boundaries, weaving a tapestry of shared insight. On the Silk Road, the Mogeo caves at Dunhuang harbor thousands of Buddhist manuscripts, some containing references to unknown teachers whose words resemble Christian aphorisms. One fragment tells of a wanderer who called on followers to take no possessions on pilgrimage, trusting divine providence for sustenance. Another praises compassion for all beings as the path to liberation. Such passages align uncannily with accounts of Jesus sending disciples out with nothing but faith. While Buddhist scribes recorded these teachings in Pali and Sanskrit, Christian copyists later rendered similar ideas in Coptic and Greek. Trade caravans carried these scrolls westward, exchanging not only silk and spices, but also spiritual concepts. Marginal notes in the margins of certain manuscripts even mention a teacher from the West, whose sayings resonate with the sutras. These marginalia hint at dialogues lost to history, conversations at dusty caravanserais where monks and missionaries debated the nature of reality. Beyond Asia, apocryphal Christian Gospels found near the Dead Sea speak of themes familiar to Buddhist readers. One text describes an inner voice that guides the soul toward truth, comparable to the Buddha's emphasis on inner witness. Another recounts a mystic who sat in silence until his mind became still, echoing meditation instructions passed down in Eastern monastic orders. These writings were hidden by Essene-like communities, careful to preserve teachings deemed too unconventional for urban congregations. When Roman forces destroyed their libraries, they smuggled copies into remote settlements. Over centuries, these scrolls were recopied in Syriac and Armenian, their origins obscured. Modern scholars, sifting through fragments in museums, detect faint echoes of Buddhist terminology alongside obscure Hebrew idioms. The result is a patchwork scripture that refuses tidy classification. It demands that readers recognize a lineage of wisdom crossing cultural and linguistic frontiers, a testament to the universal call toward inner liberation. These lost texts share a striking narrative motif: the journey inward as the true pilgrimage. They describe crossing deserts and fording rivers as external metaphors for traversing the landscapes of mind. They instruct seekers to sit beneath trees, to still the senses, and to cultivate an inner sanctuary untouched by external turmoil. Such practical guidance appears in the texts attributed to Jesus and in countless Buddhist manuals. Yet official histories segregate these teachings, casting Eastern methods as exotic and Christian asceticism as mere symbolism. In reality, both traditions converge on techniques of contemplation, mindfulness, and loving kindness. The manuscripts from Egypt and Asia invite readers to see these practices not as borrowed rituals but as expressions of a single perennial wisdom. They propose that the path to divine union transcends doctrinal walls, weaving a common thread through multiple faiths and eras. Recovery of these texts has been haphazard. Scholars working in dusty archives often stumble upon references in travelers' journals or in far-flung monastic catalogs. Fragments surface in unexpected places, wrapped around mummies, tucked inside medieval bindings, even used as architectural mortar. Each discovery fuels debate. Are these texts evidence of direct influence, or simply parallel inventions arising from universal human insight? The sheer variety of languages, Coptic, Syriac, Sanskrit, Chinese, suggests an exchange network that spanned thousands of miles. Pilgrims, merchants, and monks all played roles in transmitting ideas, copying snippets of scripture into margins and memory. They formed informal libraries of the heart, storing teachings in oral tradition where pen and parchment feared to tread. The result is a scattered corpus of writings that defy institutional curation but beckon modern seekers to piece together a mosaic of shared revelation. Institutional resistance delayed the publication of many of these texts. For centuries, papal decree forbade the translation of Gnostic Gospels into vernacular tongues. Monastic orders in Asia occasionally barred foreign scholars from accessing cave libraries. Only in the 20th century did a handful of researchers gain permission to transcribe and translate these works. Their publications sparked both excitement and controversy. Advocates hailed them as proof of a broader spiritual lineage, while skeptics warned of sensationalism and misinterpretation. The debate hinges on context. Extracts taken out of larger manuscripts can mislead, while the absence of robust provenance leaves questions unresolved. Yet even incomplete, these texts carry enough weight to challenge narrow views of religious history. They compel us to consider that early Christianity and Buddhism were not isolated phenomena but part of a dynamic tapestry of human yearning for truth. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from a cave at Turfan, where Uyghur monks stored a collection of Christian hymns translated into Old Turkic. In these songs, themes of inner light and liberation resonate with Sogdian Buddhist chants found nearby. Archaeologists uncovered wooden manuscripts coated in lacquer, texts that survived centuries thanks to the region's dry climate. Among them, a hymn praises the soul's journey through countless lifetimes toward final liberation, a concept central to both reincarnation and resurrection imagery. Such syncretic texts suggest that lay communities at the fringes of empire felt freer to blend traditions. They crafted practices that honored the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha as complementary paths. These hybrid rituals, largely ignored by mainstream historians, testify to a vibrant spiritual ecosystem where ideas flowed freely, unconstrained by doctrinal gatekeepers. Modern compilers striving to reconstruct this parallel scripture face daunting challenges. They must navigate gaps in the record, reconcile divergent translations, and guard against imposing modern categories on ancient materials. Yet with each new fragment, patterns emerge. The central themes, compassion for all beings, relinquishment of ego, recognition of an inner sanctuary, shine through diverse linguistic forms. Scholars cross-reference citations in church fathers' polemics against Buddhist Vinaya rules. They map the movement of manuscripts along old caravan routes. They interview living traditions, descendant communities that still orally transmit stories of the teacher from the West who loved meditation as much as he loved prayer. Each piece adds depth and texture to a narrative that refuses to be silenced, a testament to the human impulse to seek the divine beyond institution. The cumulative effect of these recovered texts is profound. They reveal that the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha once formed part of a shared spiritual commons. They speak of practices, silent sitting, compassionate action, inner illumination, that transcend cultural boundaries. They insist that divine truth is not locked within canonical walls but flows in currents beneath them. These writings expose how later authorities narrowed the scope of faith, trimming branches from a tree of awakening so that only a single trunk remained. But the rediscovered scriptures restore those branches, offering a fuller vision of human spirituality. They remind us that centuries ago, seekers across deserts and mountains drank from the same well of wisdom and carried its water to their homes. As we conclude our exploration of these lost Gospels and Sutras, the insight becomes clear. The spiritual heritage of humanity is far richer and more interconnected than standard histories allow. The fragments we hold are invitations to reclaim a more expansive faith, one that honors both East and West, both Christ and the Buddha, as voices of a single, timeless message. In Chapter 6, we will delve into the vaults of power where these texts were concealed, uncovering forbidden prophecies and hidden correspondences in the Vatican's secret archives. There, the whispered echoes grow louder and demand attention once more. Chapter 6: Secret Archives and Forbidden Prophecies, the Vatican's Hidden Vaults. Beneath the Vatican's towering walls and beneath marble floors lies a labyrinth of corridors and chambers sealed by iron gates. Few have ever glimpsed its contents. This is where the Church stores documents deemed too dangerous or disruptive for public view. Within the secret archives, centuries of correspondences, decrees, and manuscripts lie stacked in silent halls. Here, esoteric Christian writings mingle with diplomatic letters, maps, and coded notes. Scholars granted rare access speak of corridors lined with shelves that vanish into darkness, where only candlelight can reveal the gilt edges of leather-bound tomes. It is said that some volumes bear the faded script of early mystics, passages too radical to see daylight. Other documents hint at dialogues between popes and foreign envoys discussing Eastern teachings that bear resemblance to Buddhist sutras. The secrecy surrounding these shelves suggests that the Church has long recognized the power of these hidden texts and the threat they pose to established doctrine. Rumors swirl of a buried gospel, rumored to unite East and West in a single revelation. Centuries ago, a scholar turned cardinal confided in close associates that he had discovered a text bridging Christian and Buddhist wisdom. According to legend, he smuggled the manuscript into the archives under the seal of the Pope, fearing it would be burned if seen by theologians. This gospel, he claimed, contained teachings of compassion, detachment, and inner light in language that fused parable with sutra. No public record exists of its contents, and inquiries into the archives meet with polite refusal. Yet, unofficial notes passed among historians suggest that the document is catalogued under a cryptic reference number, known only to a handful of curial officials. Its very concealment has fueled speculation and drawn treasure hunters of the mind into fruitless quests. If it truly exists, it could corroborate the most daring theories about Jesus' engagement with Eastern spirituality. In addition to hidden gospels, the archives house prophetic writings suppressed since the Middle Ages. One set of parchments, attributed to an obscure mystic from Avignon, purportedly foresaw a time when East and West would reunite in spiritual harmony. The author spoke of two teachers born under different skies whose messages would converge in supporting the awakening of humanity. Church leaders branded the prophecies heretical, fearing that they undermined papal primacy. The documents were ordered locked away, their seals reinforced by papal bulls. Yet faint traces of these prophecies appear in marginal notes of Renaissance scholars who risked censure for quoting them. The manuscripts were then transferred to the secret archives, accompanied by strict orders forbidding any mention in future catalogs. Today, they remain accessible only to those with the highest clearances, a testament to the enduring anxiety of ecclesiastical power over any message that might dilute institutional authority. The process for accessing these hidden texts is labyrinthine. Scholars must petition through academic and ecclesiastical channels, often waiting years for a response. Permissions granted are typically narrow, confined to a single researcher under strict supervision. Even then, only photocopies of selected pages are provided, with entire sections redacted. Discussions of Eastern parallels or unorthodox teachings are carefully excised. Visit reports describe humid chambers with locked steel doors, tracks of dust on marble floors, and bewildering stacks of cord-bound codices. A single misstep or unauthorized note can lead to revoked permissions or expulsion from Vatican territory. These measures serve not only to protect fragile documents from damage, but also to insulate the Church from potential doctrinal crises. By maintaining absolute control, the Vatican ensures that only sanctioned narratives emerge from its vaults, keeping the public record tightly aligned with institutional interests. Beyond the official archives, private collections of former clerics hold fragments of banned writings. When cardinals and bishops retire, they sometimes retain personal libraries filled with texts deemed too controversial for parish use. These collections can include translations of Buddhist sutras hidden in the margins of theological treatises, letters from missionaries in India reporting on surprising associations between local masters and Christian hermits, and excerpts from apocryphal gospels that emphasize inner awakening. After their deaths, these libraries often pass to museums or universities, where they languish uncatalogued for decades. Occasionally, a curious researcher stumbles upon a volume misfiled under theology but containing references to nirvana, karma, or meditation practices. Such serendipitous finds have fueled renewed interest in the interwoven history of Christian and Buddhist thought, proving that even outside the formal archives, hidden currents of knowledge continue to surface. Inquisitive minds have long sought to trace the provenance of these forbidden texts. Some investigators focus on Vatican correspondences from the Renaissance, when humanist scholars exchanged letters with Mughal and Chinese envoys. In one letter, a diplomat mentions a papal envoy's surprise at hearing recitations of verses resembling gospel teachings in a royal court near Delhi. The envoy reportedly compared them to lost Christian homilies. Though no official reply survives, the initial letter hints at a dialogue that might have influenced early church doctrine. These diplomatic exchanges occurred at a time when the Catholic Church was both expanding and consolidating power. To admit that Christian teachings were enriched by Eastern insights could undermine claims of singular apostolic authority. Thus, the topic vanished from public correspondence, and any lingering records were seeded into the secret archives under layers of classification. The art within Vatican libraries also conceals reminders of forgotten teachings. Illuminated manuscripts display margin illustrations of lotus flowers entwined with symbols of the cross. Miniatures portray meditative figures in robes, seated beneath trees, images starkly reminiscent of Bodhi scenes found in Indian art. These details were often dismissed as artistic flourishes or misinterpretations by medieval copyists. Yet art historians note clusters of these symbols in texts dating to the 13th and 14th centuries, a period of intense cultural exchange via crusades and trade routes. The images suggest that scribes and artists absorbed Eastern iconography and integrated it into Christian manuscripts. Such veiled references could pass unnoticed by theologians but serve as subtle recollections of a more expansive spiritual narrative. They remind us that even as words were erased, visuals sometimes preserved what institutions could not entirely suppress. A select group of cardinals and scholars maintains the keys to these vaults. They are sworn to secrecy, bound by oaths that extend beyond death. Their identities are encrypted in restricted rosters, known only to a few in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. When new access protocols are drafted, These insiders debate the risks of broader disclosure. Some argue for transparency, believing that buried teachings could revitalize contemporary spirituality. Others warn of schism, insisting that the faithful are not ready for such revelations. These internal debates shape the future of what emerges from the archives. Yet whispers leak out. Fragments of conversations hint at an awareness that the hidden texts contain powerful insights on compassion, detachment, and inner sovereignty. The dilemma echoes the challenges faced by early church fathers who decided which gospels to include in the canon and which to consign to oblivion. Outside Vatican walls, interest in forbidden prophecies and hidden gospels has grown. Independent researchers, armed with digital tools, scour international libraries for catalog entries containing cryptic references. They exchange findings on obscure forums, piecing together mentions of secret collections in monasteries from Armenia to Ethiopia. Collaborative networks share high-resolution photos of marginalia and damaged folios. These citizen scholars operate without official sanction, risking legal and professional repercussions. Yet their detective work has brought to light dozens of previously unknown fragments. In some cases, their research has prompted museums to reevaluate restricted materials and release translations. While the Church remains cautious, the collective momentum of independent inquiry chips away at the walls of silence, suggesting that the hidden archives may one day yield their secrets more generously. Technological advances further complicate the vault's future. High-resolution imaging, spectral scanning, and AI-driven pattern recognition enable researchers to read palimpsests and faded scripts that were once illegible. Projects to digitize Vatican manuscripts proceed at a measured pace, with some select sections available to vetted scholars. Yet even digital access is controlled through encrypted portals and strict usage agreements. Attempts to circumvent restrictions have led to legal challenges, including litigation over alleged breaches of copyright and confidentiality. The Church defends its position by citing the need to preserve fragile documents and prevent misinterpretation. Critics argue that restricting scholarly access contradicts the Church's teachings on illuminating truth. The tug-of-war between preservation and transparency echoes the broader tension between institutional authority and the perennial call to share wisdom freely. Despite formidable barriers, a few courageous figures have spoken out. Retired librarians have published memoirs recounting late-night cataloging sessions in which they discovered references to Eastern connections. A handful of cardinals, speaking under anonymity, have voiced frustration at the slow pace of declassification. They argue that hidden prophecies foretell a time when unity between Christian and Buddhist traditions could foster global compassion. These insiders paint a picture of an archives not merely preserving history but shaping the future of faith. Their testimonies add human faces to the corridors of secrecy. They remind us that behind every locked door stands an individual who weighed duty against conscience and chose to remember rather than erase. As we stand on the threshold of these archives, the magnitude of what lies within becomes clear. The hidden vaults guard not just dusty scrolls, but the potential to redefine modern spirituality. They cradle teachings that could dissolve ancient barriers and reunite lost branches of wisdom. Yet the shadows of secrecy still loom large. In Chapter 7, we will step beyond institutional walls and gather the surviving threads of divine teaching, what Jesus and Buddha really wanted us to remember. We will reveal how, despite centuries of suppression, their shared message endures and calls us toward awakening once more. Chapter 7. the final teaching, what Jesus and Buddha really wanted us to remember. At the heart of their journeys lies a singular truth. Awakening is available to every soul. It is not the privilege of priests or monks, but the birthright of each human being. Jesus spoke of a spark shining within, a light that no darkness could overcome. Buddha revealed the luminous nature of mind, unconditioned by thought and free of suffering. Neither message depended on temple walls, sacred rites, or hierarchical intercession. Both masters pointed seekers inward, inviting them to witness the silent presence that underlies all experience. When individuals touched this truth, they discovered freedom from fear and a boundless compassion that overflowed into every action. Institutions feared that such empowerment would dissolve their authority, and so both traditions, over time, cloaked this core teaching beneath layers of doctrine and ritual. Yet the essence remained intact, waiting for those who would listen beyond borrowed words and inherited beliefs. This teaching begins with compassion, not as abstract sentiment but as active presence in each moment. It is the willingness to meet suffering with open arms rather than recoil in judgment. Jesus knelt beside the sick, the outcast, the grieving, holding their pain as his own. Buddha tended to those tormented by inner demons, guiding them through silence toward serenity. Both masters showed that compassion is not a duty imposed from without, but a spontaneous expression of awakened heart. They taught that acts of kindness reverberate outward, touching unseen lives and shifting the current of history. Yet organized religion often reframed compassion as merit earned through donation, penance, or ritual observance. The true teaching dissolves these barriers, revealing love not as transaction but as the language of the soul. In each kind gesture, no matter how small, one steps onto the path these two sons of light illuminated. Next comes detachment, a release of clinging to desire, identity, and outcome. It is not indifference, but the clarity that allows one to engage fully without being overwhelmed. Jesus urged followers to let go of worldly attachments that chain the spirit. Buddha guided disciples to observe cravings as passing phenomena rather than commands to satisfy. In this space of letting go, the heart expands, free to embrace impermanence and greet each change with equanimity. When attachment loosens its grip, fear loses its power. Yet doctrine often twisted detachment into renunciation of ordinary life, reserving true practice for monastics alone. The living teaching shows detachment as an attitude of presence, open to every moment without grasping or aversion. It invites practitioners to inhabit work, family, and community as fields of awakening, not arenas of attachment or escape. Central to their wisdom is the discovery of an inner kingdom, an unshakable sanctuary within. Jesus described this realm as hidden treasure, waiting for seekers to unearth it beneath layers of ignorance. Buddha called it the luminous mind, clear like space, empty yet pregnant with potential. Neither required pilgrimages to distant lands nor indulgence in elaborate ceremonies. Both pointed toward a direct experience accessible in the midst of daily life. In the quiet space between breath and thought, one glimpses the boundless horizon of awareness. This inner domain transcends cultural forms, drawing all seekers toward the same silent source. Yet religious institutions erected walls around sacred spaces, implying that divinity was confined to certain locations or consecrated objects. The original teaching invites each person to cultivate this sanctuary here and now, in fields, workshops, kitchens, and cities. wherever the breath flows and awareness rests. Their final gift is the unity of all beings. Jesus wove images of a body where each member matters, insisting that harm to one reverberates through the whole. Buddha taught interdependence, describing life as a web where every strand sustains the others. Both insights break down the illusion of separation, revealing that compassion for oneself and compassion for another are inseparable. In this understanding, ethics becomes intuitive care, not external command. Yet hierarchical religions often emphasize difference between saved and unsaved, chosen and damned, pure and impure. The unity teaching dissolves all such borders, teaching that every life is sacred and that liberation of one uplifts the many. When this truth takes root, prejudice falls away, and communities coalesce around shared sanctity rather than rigid doctrine. They entrusted this teaching to stories and practices that engaged body, heart, and mind. Parables became invitations to inquire. Meditation became doorways into stillness. Both tradition and transmission varied according to local culture, yet the living essence remained constant. Over time, forms multiplied and diverged. Temples, monasteries, and churches preserved invaluable resources, but also accumulated layers of dogma. The core practices, compassionate action, mindful awareness, loving presence, became obscured. Rediscovering the original simplicity requires unlearning centuries of accumulation. It demands that seekers peer beneath ritual and institution to the radiant heart of the teaching itself. In doing so, one participates in the same lineage that stretches from Bodhi tree groves to Galilean hills, a lineage not defined by sect but by awakened living. The true teaching transcends time and tradition because it speaks to universal human longing. It addresses the ache of suffering, the hunger for peace, and the yearning for connection. It does not promise escape from life but enlivens life with sacred presence. Those who taste it speak of a change so profound that everyday moments overflow with meaning. They find joy in simplicity, resilience in adversity, and unity in diversity. This teaching is not confined within any building or creed. It flourishes wherever compassion moves freely, wherever detachment grants clarity, and wherever the inner kingdom is tended like a hidden garden. It calls us to remember that awakening is the human heritage, one that precedes history and outlives institutions. Why was this message buried? Because it threatened the mechanisms of control. Institutions rely on authority over doctrine, practice, and interpretation. They depend on hierarchical gatekeepers to mediate between the sacred and the profane. A teaching that empowers every individual to encounter the divine directly undermines their role. Churches codified dogma, monasteries ordained only certain practices, leaders declared which texts were authentic. Over centuries, this process sculpted a narrative favoring structure over spontaneity, obedience over inquiry. The buried teaching remained alive in pockets, among mystics, dervishes, and wandering sages, but hidden from mainstream view. Only now, as barriers crumble, does the chance to reclaim the original message reemerge. The rediscovery of this teaching invites a renaissance of spiritual life. It asks modern seekers to embrace practices that unite rather than divide, to cultivate awareness that heals rather than harms, and to enact compassion that transforms rather than controls. It calls for communities centered on shared awakening instead of institutional allegiance. It encourages open dialogues between traditions, recognizing each as a friend on the same journey. In this reimagined landscape, Buddhism and Christianity become parallel rivers feeding the same ocean of truth. Their confluence forms a reservoir from which all beings may drink. Returning to the question posed at the beginning, we see that parallels between Jesus and Buddha are not mere coincidence but reflections of the same luminous origin. Their teachings converge on a vision of compassion, detachment, inner sanctuary, and unity that transcends culture and time. Once hidden beneath layers of dogma and forgotten in burned libraries, this vision now shines with renewed urgency. It is a call to awaken, to remember who we truly are, and to live in accordance with the timeless truths both masters revealed. As the final chapter closes, the invitation stands before each listener to turn inward, to cultivate the hidden garden of the heart, and to let the divine teaching live through every thought, word, and deed. No temple walls can contain it, no crown can control it, and no scripture can fully capture it. The teaching lives in the whisper of compassion, the stillness of detachment, and the boundless field of awareness. It awaits those ready to remember that the sacred is not elsewhere but here, in the unfolding mystery of life itself. Thus ends our journey through hidden vaults, burned scrolls, and secret prophecies. The teachings of Jesus and Buddha converge in a single stream of wisdom flowing through human history. The power of this teaching lies not in institutions or structures, but in lived awakening. May this story rekindle the light within each listener's heart and inspire the collective awakening of our shared world.